I learned in a couple of experiences in my life, kind of an answer to the question of where ideas come from. And it's very complicated, and I don't want to, that's okay. I don't want to dwell on it. It's a complicated subject. But, you know, in this movement, we're prone to think ideas come from scientists. And that is correct up to a point. But I've always, going back to the question of story, I've always thought that ideas came from listening. And that a lot of people listening to each other is what we've gone through today. And it's not easy to just synthesize what you've heard. Because the listening is a process. You have to be kind of open-minded and not tell people your story unless you're willing to hear theirs. Because your story is one thing, but from an organizer's viewpoint, you're always trying to detect what are people feeling, thinking, what words do they use. A very unscientific approach to language, but it's been a very powerful force in social movements like liberation theology in Latin America. The two examples are the Port Huron Statement, which the history books say I wrote, which was the founding document of Students for a Democratic Society. It was 27,000 words long. It tried to express a vision of our generation in 1961, 1962. We'd come through the freedom rides and the beginning of the free speech movement, what would become the free speech movement. And about 62 people, no more than are in this room, gathered in Port Huron, Michigan, thanks to the UAW that gave us a room. And I wrote the document. It's true, but in order to write the document, I interviewed tons of people. I wrote it, and then it was somehow rewritten in a 5-day period. And looking back, yeah, I certainly get credit for having set the typewriter and pounded it out and made sure that it was in the mail and all that. But the way I feel about it in retrospect is that the Port Huron Statement wrote us. That there was a spirit in the air. There was a consensus in the air. James Joyce said the same thing about his writing 50 years earlier. James Joyce said that what he was trying to write was the unwritten consciousness of his generation. So the knowledge, the feeling, the mix is in the generational experience. It's not in the writer's head. That's an old left model where the organizer comes and tells you the line and tries to make it narrow enough to rally you to a certain demand and then move on. This is more attempting to get at the actual feelings that people have not yet articulated. And I think we're in the process of articulating those feelings. Today is one day, a few hours, in a process that has been going on since I first heard of solar energy from someone in the Brown administration 40 years ago. It goes way back. It's deep. There are many ancestors and many previous attempts to express it. And I've learned that these things do take time, and there's no rushing them, even though we have to do things urgently. The other example that I think is a good one is my reading of the New Deal. Some people will try to tell you, Naomi Klein, Chris Hayes, and others have written brilliantly about slavery being the comparison, the last time that money was divested from the property being human beings. I have a hard time with that analogy because of the Civil War that followed and the continuation of slavery in the form of Jim Crow. But all right, I see the point, especially the comparison with the abolitionist movement and today's street movements around the globe. But the reason I think of the New Deal, I guess, is because I am a writer, first and foremost, movement activist, and a 20-year participant in the legislative process. And I was born at a moment that the New Deal saved my family. And it was before and during my birth and my first 2 or 3 years that this happened. So I can only go back and listen to people and ask what happened. What happened is that my grandfather died in a cannery accident, the fault of the Carnation Milk Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He fell in a vat and was chopped up. He left my grandma with 11 kids. And this was during the Depression. And she survived during the Depression and took care of those kids. And during that time, she was sustained by a $5,000 check from the company with regret for the death of her husband. There was no pension, there was no Social Security, there were no rights of organized labor. Her world fell apart in the late 20s, early 30s. I don't remember all that much about her, but I remember her as being sort of the quintessential nanny, the grandmother, and all these kids. And what they were doing in the Depression was huddling up together like students do today, 5 to an apartment who don't know each other, but living through a semester at NYU or wherever. And they were selling apples, and they were doing odd jobs together and pooling what little they made every day in order to buy food and pay the bills to get to the next day. They were not political. This is a key point in my sharing with you, that I believe with C. Wright Mills that we have to reach people who are in their personal milieu, and their problem is that they're detached from history and social structure. They don't know what has happened to them. They are in a catastrophe, and they are prone, if they're working people, to think there's something wrong with them, their ethnicity, their class, their lack of education. They're not prone to automatically blame an outside aggressor. That would take a level of pride and insolence and insubordination, so to speak, a mutinous mentality that they don't have. They're survivors, and they know a lot. I'm not saying they lack knowledge. They know a lot. I learned that, too, after leaving the university and going to Mississippi and Georgia and Newark, that poor people know a lot that middle-class people do not know unless they come from that background. But anyway, in the middle of this process of the collapse of capitalism, the collapse of what government we had, there were the stirrings of the New Deal. There were social movements, Communist Party led, organizing drives in manufacturing plants, got nowhere. People got fired, people got clubbed down, beat up, shot. Anarchists tried to do it in their horizontal way, to borrow the current language of the current movement. Trotskyists kept attacking everyone on both sides for not following the correct line. farmers, I don't remember if they picked up pitchforks, but they went to work against the banks and the Grange, and they started a period of turbulent working class expression and middle class expression at having been sold out by somebody. And it started with finding ways to make enough food to eat, and it ended up with doing everything possible to obstruct the business as usual of the times unless they were fed, unless their children were fed, unless they could go to school, unless there was somebody to say that there was hope on the horizon, to borrow a more recent phrase. And I remember my mom went through this, you know, the orphan of father she hardly knew. And when I was growing up at the end of the 30s and the beginning of the Great War, I remember sitting on her lap a lot, and she'd always talk to me about how she loved Roosevelt. And I didn't know who Roosevelt was. I just thought, Roosevelt, that's God. My mother loves God, and Roosevelt is taking care of us. She would keep saying that. Because by that time, after these revolutionary inciting of working people and average everyday people, they had achieved Social Security. And I can't tell you what that would mean for my mother when she's thinking about Grandpa. They achieved bargaining rights for organized labor, unheard of, seemingly impossible. They achieved pensions and all the rest of it. And they had achieved what was known as the New Deal, but at the time it was being built, they did not call it the New Deal. They called it the movement. It didn't have a name. They didn't announce, now we are starting a movement for a New Deal. What happened was this strange mix of a revolutionary impulse on the one hand, a liberal impulse from do-gooders who wanted a better government second, people in the center who were very frightened at the possibility of social disorder and were timid about raising their head, and then people on the right, like my priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who was busy organizing an anti-Semitic response to the very same conditions, and working closely with Henry Ford on the idea of a new Nazi party based in my hometown of Royal Oak or Hamtramck. The people on the far right thought Roosevelt was a communist. I don't remember if they questioned his birth. But he was leading us to a Soviet America. The people on the left, some of the people on the left thought that was a great idea, Soviet America. They were in little discussion circles constantly reading textbooks from Marx and Engels about the future of Soviet America. Most people that I would identify with were organizers. They were selfless people who didn't work for much money, didn't think far ahead to the careers that they would hold as future labor bureaucrats or Democratic Party administrators. They wanted to know if they'd have their heads crushed by a policeman's baton, and they were willing to do that. There's sort of a lost generation there in history. And there was another group, maybe a little like some people you know are the scientists today in climate science. They were known as the brain trust of the New Deal. And they were a very eclectic group of people who were brainy, intellectuals. And they were probably in the most important American tradition that I've ever studied, and I consider myself part of, the American pragmatic tradition. And I know that pragmatism is now a dirty word, but if you look under it, it means listen first, see how far people are willing to go and improvise a step forward, a program that will take you a little bit towards survival or a little bit towards a better life as rapidly as you can. The New Deal Brain Trust invented all these amazing programs. One parallel today would be like if somebody said, we need a renewables work administration, like the NRA. We need to put every person in this country and on this planet who's out of a job or underemployed into a great employment project, publicly funded, privately funded, but it has to happen because there's a great work to be done. The great work is to save us from the Depression in those days. The great work today is to save us from climate catastrophe and the end of civilization as we know it. No one had that idea in 1929. They were gripped with that idea by 1937. The whole idea of industrial workers being organized, the whole idea of old age pensions, of doing something about the Buddhist lament that life is all about suffering, delivering people Social Security, having to sit at a table and argue about whether we can also do health care, being told by the president, we don't have the votes, we can't do that. Some future generation will fight for health care. That's how the New Deal was pounded out. It was improvised by very creative people who dared to take it on and who simply believed that their current lives were unlivable. And they didn't have to be poor to know that. It was just an unlivable situation with fascism approaching over here and with depression never seeming to end. And out of that pragmatic determination, they decided the government has got to hire people, the government has got to protect people, the government is what saved my mother and why she loved Franklin Roosevelt. And it was a close call. You know, we could have gone to the right, we could have gone into chaos, and the answer to what might have happened we'll never know because then came World War II, and everybody thought problem solved. Everybody's working down the street in the empty plant, they're building planes and tanks and trucks and jeeps and cars. The car industry was formed out of that experience. My father went to work as an accountant for a car company. Detroit was booming. My mother loved Roosevelt for those reasons, not ideological. And when we come to that point when people are unable to be trapped in ideology but are willing to do what works, that's the time when I think we'll have the equivalent of a New Deal for the climate catastrophe. There are people who argue that there's no climate problem, but we had those people. There are people who are fascistic in their inclinations. There's people who, unfortunately, are ideologically, they believe in a market even though there really is no pure market. It's all government supported through incentives or taxes or mandates, but they believe so much in the market that they, they scream at Obama, don't take the government shouldn't take my Social Security away. They're mad in a good way. They're really angry, but there's a madness that's ideological. They don't have a picture, and I'm talking about the Tea Party and people that I thought would fade away, but seem to get more ferocious as the threat grows. So there were people who said, okay, we're going to invest in the rebuilding of America and after the war in a Marshall Plan for the world. And they cut a deal without a handshake, as far as I know, but But the capitalist class, the finance capitalists, divided over whether they thought that their obligation was to reform the system in order to stabilize their profit, or crack down on these insurgents and stop them in their tracks and go all the way to drive them off the political map towards God knows what kind of system we would have had. And on the other hand, you had labor and social movements and populist movements where the argument was, should we take the right to collective bargaining or go all the way to socialism? It was kind of like 1919, and I was there too, when the socialists told the suffragettes, all the way with socialism first, then you women will get your right to vote. And the women said, not taking that offer, thank you very much. Some of us are socialists, some are not, but we want the right to vote. And we're at a similar crossroads if you read Naomi Klein's excellent new book, a similar debate. So I come from experience, not ideology, not theory. I do my reading, I try my best, but my sense is the most we're going to accomplish here, which is quite a lot when you think of the state of the planet, is a global Green New Deal. We need the green billionaires, like the gentleman in the back of the room. We need the Katies too, the younger generation. But somebody has to cut a deal because unless you believe that we have to have revolution first and then save the planet, if you believe that, I advise you to listen. Just go to meetings in your community, in your PTA, in your neighborhood, and ask, get up actually and say, I want a revolution first, what do you people think? And you'll see that they're not there now. They might be thinking about it, but it's a simple fact that we need to have this green infrastructure, this green bank that the previous panel was talking about, a green financing mechanism, and at the same time, just as labor needed to be organized and respected in their dignity, we need all the people of color, the disenfranchised communities of California, to feel that they have been invited to the table and that they're going to get somewhere, that this is not another talk session, that the governor has to set a deadline, as any state needs to set to avoid chaos. We need to double the rate of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We need to get the brain trust to understand that that is necessary, because if we don't do it, it will even get worse. We need to go to at least 50% or 60% solar and renewables as part of our electrical system. We need to reject the idea that the grid is some holy place, like a medieval church that needs to be respected, and remind people that it took people power to knock out the nuclear plant in Sacramento, that we were told if there's no nuclear in Sacramento, we'd be dead because it's so hot there. Go to Sacramento now. Ask the people here from Sacramento. Last time I was there, it was 110 degrees, and they had an electricity surplus. Surplus. Why isn't that a model in our story? 110 degrees and running a energy surplus through a publicly owned utility whose board members are elected. And people who are investors are still making lots of money off it. So I think that is what we should look at. I hesitate to say that I'm sure of it, but I feel that that's the way it's going. And what what needs to be done, and what is great about Naomi Klein's book, is that people need to talk about it. It has to have a name. You know, Mark said earlier that nobody knows what the California story is. It could be because people in California are too busy with their projects to identify where they're going, or the governor's afraid of Republicans. And it's not that the story is perfect. We know from today that we need to be on an all-out alert to stop fracking. And we need to tell the governor if he wants climate leadership on the planet, fracking will be his Achilles heel. We need to put out of commission this infernal Dracula of the nuclear power lobby that seems to go on fumes. Where is capitalism helping us with nuclear power? They never stop. They say we have to have a robust nuclear industry to achieve our climate goals. I call that, it comes from madness. It basically, you know, it's a Chernobyl future or, you know, climate catastrophe future. California is a very precious place, not because somebody designed it that way originally, but because we are an advanced economy with 199,000 jobs in the clean energy industry, and we're getting rid of coal and getting rid of nuclear. There's a lot of people that don't want to see that. They used to say, well, Governor Moonbeam, who listens to him? They can't call him Moonbeam any longer, but they can wait him out. He's only got one more term. And they can try to avoid that California model, that idea that you can have an advanced economy run on 100% renewables step by step without nuclear and without coal. They don't want that idea floated out there because some of them think their interests would be harmed. They don't know that it may be in their best interest. It may really be in their best interest. So I think it's a complicated course that we have to navigate, and we need organizers. We need people to drill down on this. I think we have had enough of the science elite. They have delivered us such great material on how to get to 100%, but they don't know how to get to it politically. You know, they got the desert is covered with giant parabolic collectors, and the Sierra Club is worried about birds. And you say that's the only way we can get to 100% renewables, by destroying the desert and the wildlife. That leads you into endless committee hearings and litigation, and the only thing that can avoid that confusion is more consensus, more dialogue. How are we going to get there? We have precious little time to get there, but we know from the science that it is inevitable that things will get worse, and it's also, to me, inevitable from my experience that people will fight back. And it's all one step at a time. The starting point, I think, is to combine the notions of reducing emissions and achieving jobs and environmental justice. The finance capitalists will have to accept the jobs argument, the empowerment of poor people, that's not in their normal picture, and the environmental justice advocates will have to convince themselves that this emissions catastrophe is really real and is really going to wipe us out, and that we have 5 or 10 years to get through it as safely as we can. So, having said that, I think we should think about it, constitute some kind of mechanism, maybe through Bioneers. Have another meeting soon. I'm suggesting in January, simply because it's simple that first we've got to see how the election goes. Does Jerry Brown get a mandate of 60% or not? Second, we've got to see how Lima goes. Does the whole idea of a global deal collapse because of arguments between the poor of Latin America and the rich of the north. Do we get through that? Can Jerry Brown and Kevin De Leon get us through that needle in Lima? Then they got to come back and deal with the Koch brothers and the Republicans and the corporate Democrats and everybody that's trying to sabotage us on this side. And how far will they go? The farther they go, of course, the better for all of us, better for our health care, better for our air, better for jobs. The slower they go, the slower the U.S. will go, and you know where that winds up. California goes forward, it's like we're the locomotive. California stops, the train goes backwards. And we end up with Kentucky as the middle of the road. And that's not good. There's 33 states that are controlled by coal interests. There's only about 25, 26, 27 states where we got a shot. But that's the green bloc that has to be organized state by state, community by community, to have such power that they can push back until the inevitable gets worse and we see the investments flowing. And the investments have to flow in an equitable way, in a fair way. That's what happened with the New Deal. The poor got better off. The workers got rights. Business got rich by stabilizing capitalism. That's where we are, and I think that's where we're probably having to go. But we're going to have to continue to resume this discussion, and I want to just end by thanking all the great people who have facilitated this process, especially the young ones who were really born after my time. I have to really question what the hell I'm doing here. You know, if you read Thoreau's book that was published after his life, The Dispersion of Seeds, which is a book that kind of is a gospel for Bioneers, it's about the growth of communities and the rise of new generations. And at one point, Thoreau says, and I'm quoting, "We find ourselves in a world that is already planted, but is also being planted as at first." That's the transition we're in. That's the planting and cultivating that we're doing. And we see in these panels, we see in these slideshows, these PowerPoint presentations, a new world rising that has been cultivated, but is again being planted as at first. And what Thoreau said was he had faith. The title of his essay was, "I have faith in a seed, so do I."